We're going to take a look at chapter 17, which is Manifest Destiny. Manifest Destiny was a term that was coined by an Irish newspaper writer by the name of John O'Sullivan in reference to this idea that the Americans believed that they had this sort of biblical right to the western frontier. This is going to play a major role because as we continue to move west, the issue of free versus slave state is going to continue to come up, right? So again, exposing the elephant in the room. So one of the things that we'll see is that eventually, after Martin Van Buren, we will get a new president, a Whig president, in the same way that they were able to elect Andrew Jackson. One of the things that the Whigs did is they came up with a way of making William Henry Harrison sort of become sort of like the common man's president. So they sort of sold the same thing to the American people. And so Harrison becomes the president of the United States. But in reality, William Henry Harrison was more of a puppet. And the puppet masters in this case were Secretary of State Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. And so one of the things that we'll see is that these guys were truly the ones that were pulling the string. They actually, one of the things that they were hoping to do, like I said, was by pulling the strings, was kind of implement a bunch of Whig proposals into the federal government. Now, one of the things that's going to happen, though, is that William Henry Harrison is actually going to give an inauguration speech that's about 2 hours long. And he does it without a jacket, he does it in freezing cold, and he actually gets sick. He gets pneumonia. So the doctors began treating him by bleeding him and doing a bunch of other stuff. And eventually he dies. And so with him dies this proposed scheme to kind of control what the Whigs wanted to do. So the new president is a guy by the name of John Tyler. He was the vice president. He's from Virginia. He was very stubborn, was not a big fan of Henry Clay or Daniel Webster. And so Tyler was a states' rights advocate, and he rejected the bank and the tariff and a lot of Whig things. And so he, in terms of being the new president, is going to create a sort of conflict with the Whigs. So the Whigs in Congress ended the independent treasury. Tyler signed it. Clay engineered the passage of a new bank. Tyler vetoed it. The Whigs referred to Tyler as His Excellency. The Whigs expelled the Democrat Tyler from the party. They tried to impeach him, but all the cabinet members except for Webster resigned. So they were saying that he was basically a Democrat in Whigs clothing. Tyler vetoed the first tariff, but reluctantly signed a lower tariff to lower it to 32% by 1842. One of the things that we'll see, right, is that Texas, in terms of wanting to become annexed, right, so the U.S. was afraid of foreign powers, France using British and Texas versus U.S. conflict to violate the Monroe Doctrine. The Brits wanted Texas for cotton. So the United States began to sort of worry that other European powers might actually come in and try to annex Texas themselves. So due to fears, Texas became a campaign issue for the election of 1844. The pro-expansionist James Polk, a Democrat, defeated the non-expansionist Clay, and Tyler interpreted it as a mandate to acquire Texas. So in 1845, Texas was annexed by a joint resolution, which meant that Mexico was going to be really angered. So the annexation of Texas, as you can see there, that is the original size of what Texas was. So one of the other things that we'll see also is that both England and the United States had strong claims to Oregon based on trade, exploration, Lewis and Clark. 1830s missionary presence helped settle and secure the southern part of Oregon for the United States. And of course, we had the 1819 treaty with England for Oregon. 1818, the U.S. and Britain agreed to joint occupation. The 1840s, Oregon fever led to about 5,000 U.S. settlers by 1846. Only a few hundred for Great Britain, so the British began to realize the implications of being overrun by the Americans. The U.S. wanted the border to be the 49th parallel. Britain wanted the Columbia River, so the issue overshadowed in 1844 with the election by debate of annexation of Texas. 1844 election, the Whigs chose Clay, right? The expansionist and Democrat Party engineered the nomination of Polk, the first dark horse sort of candidate. Polk was the Speaker of the House, and he was also the governor of Tennessee. He was also backed by Jackson. He was actually a huge proponent of Jackson and the other way around too. So this idea, like I was saying, right, of manifest destiny, we'll take a look at this picture in class, was campaign issue, the view that God had destined the American people with democracy to control the hemisphere. Again, this was written by John O'Sullivan in 1845. The Democrats called for the annexation of Texas and all of Oregon. So the Whigs responded by tying Polk to slavery and Clay to liberty. Clay was hurt by straddling the fence on Texas. Polk won the election by a mere 5,000 votes in New York was the difference. The Liberty Party cost Clay the presidency. And again, we'll talk a little about that. Polk developed the 4-point program to achieve under 4 years. His first point was that he was going to lower the tariff. The Treasury Secretary Robert Walker lobbied Congress for Walker Tariff of 1846, reduced the rates 32% to 25%, but yet gave good revenue because of strong economy. The second point was the independent Treasury achieved in 1846, so having a Treasury Department to be able to manage the finances. The third point was to acquire California, and the fourth point was to acquire Oregon. Polk began proposing the 49th parallel. The British first said no, but realized Columbia River not that valuable area because it had been furred out. So Britain agreed to the 49th. The Senate quickly approved, despite some claims for 54-40 forever. The vote was influenced by the fact that the war with Mexico had started. Polk and others felt manifest destiny also included California. So in 1845, the population of California was mostly Indians and Spanish Mexicans, less than 1,000 Americans. Polk wanted to buy California, but Mexico was upset by damaged claims and, of course, because of Texas. The Texas dispute was heightened by a boundary dispute, the Nueces River or the Rio Grande, right? Polk kept U.S. troops out of disputed area. Polk thought the British might buy it, sent minister to Mexico City to purchase, and Mexico refused to even hear. So in January 1846, Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande, but did not provoke Mexican army initially. In April of May that same year, impatient Polk moved to declare war, but his plan worked. Mexico started shooting, and 16 U.S. soldiers were killed. So, in other words, Mexico started, but again, we'll talk about it. So Polk declared shedding of American blood on American soil. In other words, that this was American soil that they were shedding blood on. Congress voted for war. Congressman Abraham Lincoln was suspicious, and he actually introduced this idea, what's called the spot resolutions, to get info about location of attacks. The anti-slavery Whigs called Polk a liar. Polk was provoked war to grab California, right, and protect from the British. Western expansionists also wanted war against Mexico, but Mexico also wanted to retaliate against bullies of the North, invade the U.S. and free the slaves. Polk wanted a limited war just to get California, but Santa Anna double-cross led to larger war. The opportunist John Fremont, with local Americans, proclaimed short-lived California Republic. Polk's Representative Nicholas Triss was embarrassed by Santa Anna, finally negotiates Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War. The first part of the treaty was that the U.S. would get all land between Texas and Oregon, including California. The U.S. would pay $15 million for land and agreed to pay damage claims against Mexico, $3.25 million. Two problems that came with ratification. The conscious Whigs got control of the House in 1847, threatened to defund the war. And so the conscious Whigs, essentially what they were Whigs who were against expansionism on the basis that it was wrong because of slavery. And so one of the things that we'll see is that as more and more of these conscious Whigs move into Congress, it's going to make it the South begin to question this idea that the Northern government's going to try to persuade the federal government to get rid of slavery. It's a picture of Charles Sumner, a young Charles Sumner that we'll talk a little bit more about later. Manifest Destiny expansionists were calling for all of Mexico. Calhoun moderated Southern greed, encouraged ratification. Critics suggested $18.25 million was for guilty conscience, but need for haste was likely motivator. The war cost 13,000 U.S. lives, most from disease, fairly cheap. Enormous gains. U.S. territory increased by 1/3, larger than the Louisiana Purchase. Military success impressed the British and foreign critics. After the war, Latin America feared U.S., condemned the American greed. Heightened slavery tensions, Santa Anna's revenge. Some felt war was provoked by slavocracy, symbolized by the Whale-Whitmont proviso here. And here you have Congressman Wilmot. So we'll talk about all these things in class.